Welcome to the 2022 Bio Members Reading. I am Linda Level, President of Bio. Every year we like to recognize biographies published by our members since the previous year's conference. The 15 books represented here this afternoon provide a fascinating cross-section of our membership and the diversity of biographies we produce each year. The books are published by major trade presses, university presses, and small independent publishers. The writers come from Ireland and Australia and from across the U.S. The subjects literally range from saints to whores. It is perhaps not surprising that as writers we are often drawn to the lives of other writers. 7 of the 15 books are about writers. Each author will read a passage from their book for 3 minutes. These are arranged in rough chronological order by the birth date of the subject. You will see an image of the book cover and then watch the author reading. Enjoy!
If the king was concerned, his court was concerned, and no one more so than the slave girl. How could she not be? She tracked the king's reaction to every event, no matter how small. It seems that she was, at this point, the king's concubine, although she could have even been his official wife. The records tell us only that the king had her, and that he was besotted. As a slave, the girl's worth was less than that of a hunting dog, less than a cow. And it was a life full of hazards, open fires, undercooked and spoiled food, lice and parasites, and the groping hands of fellow slaves and overlords alike. But she had already survived much worse. She had been born at the end of the coldest decade in the past 2 millennia. A volcanic eruption in Iceland had plunged the world into darkness, disrupting harvests. And while the Western world was gripped by famine, another horseman of the apocalypse had galloped in. Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, born into Europe by rats carrying infected fleas. To this enslaved girl and the people in her childhood world, the conditions in the middle of the 6th century must have seemed like the end of days. To be born in such times could be considered a great misfortune, but it could also be a great opportunity. The air, cold as it was, crackled with possibilities for the survivors. Fortunes could be made in a month. A great family could fall, dropping dead in a matter of days. An ambitious family could move into that abandoned villa, elbowing their way into the aristocracy. Even the villa's surviving slaves had cause for hope. They could seize the opportunity to run away and melt in the crowds of refugees. They could comfort a grieving widow or widower on a neighboring estate and marry their way up. Being enslaved was not an enviable state of affairs, but it could be a temporary one. But even in a time of such unusual social mobility, the transformation that this girl had pulled off was impressive. From kitchen slave to one of the queen's serving maids, and now the king's companion. Such a rise took iron will, careful planning, and the honing of small talents. The ability to slip in and out of a room unnoticed, to intuit which cook or lackey was likely to let slip a choice bit of information. And perhaps, as some of her contemporaries mused, such a rise required dabbling in the dark arts too. Temperatures had since stabilized and the initial waves of the plague receded, but it remained an age that favored the bold. She would later prove herself its equal, capable of quick and decisive action. For now, though, as the king fumed over his brother's foreign bride, the slave girl, Fredegund, was content to watch and wait.
At the end of his life, Francis of Assisi despaired for the future of his brothers, and he turned to Clare. Clare, only 30 years of age, was confined to her bed. She had fasted away the reserves of her youth and most likely had succumbed to a constellation of maladies brought on by malnutrition. Whatever her symptoms, when Francis heard that she was at the point of death, he insisted that he be taken to her without delay. At St. Damien, the women greeted him with joy, reverence, and tears. To some, his long-sought arrival may have confirmed that Claire really was passing from this life. Even those who remained in the cloister, peering through a parted curtain over the iron-grilled window, saw that Francis' own decline had been precipitous, as evidenced by his haggard face and blighted eyes that turned from the light. Here at last, however, he was surrounded by those who loved him, not only Claire's community, but brothers who were loyal to him. What Francis and Claire said to each other is unrecorded. Because she was so ill, Claire was set apart from the others so that she could rest and receive care while the regular life of the community continued. Francis, finding her lying on a plank of wood, ordered that a sack of straw be found for her mattress. Her voice was weak, almost unearthly, but the vision he held was of the younger, fair and vital woman whom he had persuaded to serve repugnant lepers and to preach to scoffers on the streets of Assisi. Now the lepers were banished, and Claire was dying, deprived of the world that Francis had opened to her when she swore obedience to him after fleeing her family in the dead of night. When he had last seen her about a year earlier, he had let a psalm of repentance speak for him. Whether he now tried to explain to her or to himself that he had tried to save the lesser brothers by abandoning his female followers, and whether or not he asked directly for her forgiveness, surely she forgave him and claimed there was nothing to forgive. Francis had managed to undo the worst of what the cardinal had dictated for her life. Philip had returned, the brothers could visit them, and they were not entirely shut off from the world. His emotions may have overwhelmed what was left of Francis' strength, because soon his eyes failed and light became unbearable. He would remain for more than 50 days in a hut prepared for him a few yards outside Claire's window. Rather than die, Claire was restored to life, if not to total health. She saw that he too needed care, and she sat up and called for scissors and thread, then snipped 19 swatches from the hem and back of her own cape, and neatly sewed them on the cowl and in other shabby spots of Francis' tunic. Possibly it was she who stitched a special new hood that dropped well down over his sensitive eyes to block out painful light.
As the years wore on, Charlie Murphy grew increasingly petulant. The survival reflexes he had developed in his younger days proved to be his undoing when the team's success simply required him to thrive. As the sport skyrocketed in popularity, baseball executives needed to craft a product that met the emerging standards of the progressive era. To be more specific, Van Johnson wanted to root out owners who did not care about the perception of organized baseball as a whole. Murphy used the press as a stereotypical Chicago booster would have to promote his local team. However, Johnson wanted public attacks on the leagues themselves to cease because they made organized baseball appear weak. One of the most well-known anecdotes about Charlie Murphy relates how his ill-timed firing of Johnny Evers opened the door for Van Johnson to get his way and oust the Cubs owner in 1914. Originally, Murphy had tried to position himself as a champion of the National League, but the other owners suspected otherwise, so he gave up and favored his own franchise. In 1914, Murphy's unwillingness to elevate league loyalty above his interest in the Cubs during organized baseball's hostilities with the Federal League threatened the establishment and led to his ouster. The result is that the burned ashes of Murphy's entire career have been thrown to the wind. This book pieces together the scattered fragments of Murphy's personal and professional life to revisit and reassess his role in baseball and beyond. It examines how Murphy's influence extended outside of Chicago to include his contributions to his hometown of Wilmington, where he built a luxurious theater for his former neighbors to enjoy. But it's mostly about baseball and one man who set the sport on its ear. In various contexts, historians have called Charles Webb Murphy an odd duck with a big mouth, an insufferable blowhard, and little more than a salaried flunky. Frankly, in moments of time, those assessments hold kernels of accuracy. Murphy made his share of egregious gaffes, but his foundational successes have not been rigorously analyzed. Too frequently, they have been taken for granted or dismissed as inevitable. Murphy has been presented as a poorly written stock character from a bad novel who bumbled his way to the top of the baseball world through comedic luck. Upon closer examination, someone much more complex emerges. A complicated, brilliant human being immersed in the world of organized baseball during the Progressive Era. Hugh Fullerton summed up his friend this way: he was a showman, a baseball fanatic, a quick-thinking, quicker-acting fellow whose fiery, impulsive temperament kept the entire baseball world bubbling.
Philip Payne incorporated the Afro-American Realty Company in 1904. This is a passage from page 62 explaining that process. The company's certificate of incorporation, with its staid language, remained in the office of the New York County Clerk, but for the public, Philip Payne produced an 8-page pocket-sized prospectus that revealed his understanding of how to market to African Americans and announced the revolutionary mission of the Afro-American Realty Company. In explaining the company's purpose, the pamphlet homed in on the recent eviction effort. When the movement was started to put the colored people out of West 135th Street, this co-partnership, being unable to lease any houses on this street, voted to buy and did buy 2 5-story flats valued at $50,000 and thereby stemmed the tide, which, had it been successful in West 135th Street, would surely have extended to West 134th Street, which is almost entirely given over to our people. By using business tactics, Payne and the Afro-American Realty Company's investors resolved to fight fire with fire in head-to-head confrontations with the white-owned businesses and real estate investors who sought to oust African Americans from Harlem. The pamphlet stated that race prejudice is a luxury and, like all other luxuries, can be made very expensive in New York City if the Negroes will but answer the call of the Afro-American Realty Company. The prospectus differed from the plain pamphlets developed by most other businesses. The Colored American magazine described it as bound in chocolate-colored covers and adorned with the imprint of an African's head. Its cover was dominated by a design in black and white that included an ornate pendant accented by curly cues. The lower portion of the pendant included a drawing of the face of a Black man. The man's image was not a caricature, but a realistic drawing of a half-smiling, pleasant-looking person who, beneath full eyebrows and medium-length curly hair, looked over his broad nose directly at the reader. In the wider upper portion of the pendant, the name of the company was spelled out in white capital letters: Afro-American Realty Company.
Parker Hitt was an extraordinary Army officer with many skills. His wife, Genevieve Young Hitt, was the first woman to break codes and ciphers for the U.S. government. Parker Hitt was a man of many talents. He could shoot, hunt and clean his kill, ride a bicycle and a horse, climb a tower, conduct a survey, draw a map, play the banjo and baseball, dance, fish, drive a car and a dog sled, send Morse code, construct a code, build a telephone switchboard and a rifle target, modify a machine gun, fix a boiler, repair a lawnmower and a sewing machine, replace a marine engine, pilot a boat, write a book, play bridge, engineer a bridge, improve a signal lantern, drill troops, fight a battle, erect telephone poles, string telephone wire, fly a Wright plane, give a speech, teach a class, operate a radio, invent a cipher device, care for dogs, make architectural drawings, design a building, develop a war plan, kill an adversary, recover a body, plan a funeral, raise a gunboat, put up a tent, set up a machine gun, cook a meal, make ice cream, ice skate, solve a cipher, dig a garden, comfort a child, and complain to higher authorities. He survived disease, typhoons, 2 train wrecks, a fall from a horse, combat, and a serious health crisis in middle age. He was a good correspondent, a voracious reader, a talented artist, a caring son, a loving spouse, a tolerant parent, and an advocate for women in the workplace. Hitt was frugal and cranky, courteous and gallant. He was devoted to the army and patriotic, and he cut a fine figure in his dress blues. He knew 2 presidents, 2 senators, innumerable other elected officials, and a poet. He respected others for the work they did and earned the loyalty of those who served with him. People were glad to know him. He had a straightforward view of the world as something to be mastered. He was ingenious. Hitt led his own life unencumbered by expectations, and he wanted others to do the same. He was not one for hero worship, and desired no tribute or monument. From Indianapolis to Front Royal he followed his instincts and lived a life of usefulness, great accomplishment, and modest comfort. Hitt enjoyed life, for as the card Genevieve gave him in 1933 jokingly reminded him, he would be a long time dead. Thank you.
Hello, I'll read to you from Chapter 1, The Roads to Rapallo. What began as a case of the flu in October 1927 quickly progressed into an illness so severe that W.B. Yeats's doctors warned he might never write poetry again. He was 62 years old, a senator in the Irish Free State, the founding director of the Irish National Theatre, and a Nobel laureate. He had recently finished a volume of poetry, The Tower, which would be credited with revolutionizing modern literature to the same extent as Ulysses and The Wasteland. Yeats was exhausted. He was also, as he confessed to his most intimate confidants, extremely bitter. Worried about the effect that a dark, wet Irish winter would have on his health, W.B. and his wife George left Dublin in November for southern Europe. They travelled by ship to Gibraltar, then up the Spanish coast and the French Riviera to Cannes, where they stayed for Christmas and the New Year. There was no doubt that W.B. was suffering from a physical ailment, but George thought that his illness was also psychological. 27 years younger than him, well educated in the classics and European languages, and gifted with a dry wit, George could be exceedingly patient with W.B.'s complaints. She tried to distract him with philosophical debates, but her diversions provided short relief. Every now and then she allowed herself to vent her frustration to her closest friends, one of whom was Thomas McGreevy, an Irishman in his 30s who had survived the Somme and was embarking on a career as a literary critic. In one exasperated letter she told McGreevy, "Until he remembers he mustn't think, he prances about in bed full of joy, then suddenly flops down. I must stop. My blood pressure will go up." George worried. If something isn't done, he'll sink into awful depths of depression and despair. I hope to get him to Rapallo. In fact, well or ill, I am going to get him there. When the Yeatses arrived, Rapallo was still modestly fashionable all year round. W.B. took pride in the town's unpretentiousness. In his essay, Rapallo, he boasted, "As there's no great harbour full of yachts, no great yellow strands, no great ballroom, no great casino, the rich carry on elsewhere their strenuous lives." Rapallo's permanent residents included the German dramatist and novelist Gerhard Hauptmann, with whom Yeats would make acquaintance as Rapallo's other Nobel laureate, and the English essayist and caricaturist Max Beerbohm, whom Yeats would see very little. In fact, Hauptmann and Beerbohm's presence was incidental. Rapallo, for Yeats, revolved around Ezra Pound.
This reading is from the final passage of my new book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the Jazz Age. Despite her passionate pursuit of posterity, it was not Polly Adler, the empress of vice, but her male criminal colleagues who became cultural icons of the 20th century. Prohibition's excesses enshrined the gangster as an American archetype, whose lordly ambitions and tragic flaws are considered essential to understanding our national character. But the Scarlet Woman as Horatio Alger tale never grabbed the American imagination the way the rum runners and racketeers did. This is because sex workers in general, and Polly in particular, are dealers in illusion. The illusion of intimate connection between strangers, of desires without limits or consequences, of spontaneous ecstasy on command, or whatever else the human id can dream up and pay for. Polly's mastery of this mysterious art was the source of her significance, and it contributed in no small part to the glorious legends of the Jazz Age. However, Americans have little appetite for examining the dreary mechanics behind the spectacle of our dreams. Polly, for all her longing to be known, hid far more of her story than she shared, even with herself. If she has not received her historical due, it is in part because she is a symbol whose reality contradicts the very myths that make this era so captivating and charismatic. And that, as she would be the first to admit, is a very hard sell. But don't count her out. As she said near the end of her life, "I have always been a fighter, and I hope to Christ I don't stop till curtain time." Perhaps Polly's story is better suited to this 21st century, where there is a vital interest in exposing the intersections of sex and power, and in dismantling the conspiracies of silence that protect powerful people from bearing the full cost of their desires. Thank you.
I'm Rebecca Donner, the author of All the Frequent Troubles of Our Days. I'm at a literary festival right now, so I'm recording this in my hotel room. The excerpt I'm going to read is from the introduction of my book. Her aim was self-erasure. The more invisible she was, the better her chances of survival. In her journal, she noted what she ate, read, thought. The first was uncontroversial. The second and third were not. For this reason, she hid the journal. When she suspected the Gestapo was closing in on her, she destroyed it. Burned it, most likely. She was at the harrowing center of the German resistance, but she wasn't German, nor was she Polish or French. She was American, conspicuously so. The men she recruited acquired code names: Armless, Beamer, Worker. She operated under no code name. Still, she was elusive. The nature of her work required absolute secrecy. She didn't dare tell her friends, who were scattered across the towns and dairy farms of the Midwest. They remained bewildered that she, at 26, had jumped aboard a steamer ship and crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind everyone she loved. Her family is my family. 3 generations separate us. She preferred anonymity, so I will whisper her name: Mildred Harnock. In 1932, she held her first clandestine meeting in her apartment, a small band of political activists that grew into the largest underground resistance group in Berlin by the end of the decade. During the Second World War, her group collaborated with a Soviet espionage network that conspired to defeat Hitler, employing agents and operatives in Paris, Geneva, Brussels, and Berlin. In the fall of 1942, the Gestapo pounced. She was thrown in prison. So were her co-conspirators. During a hastily convened trial at the Reichskriegsgericht, the Reich Court-Martial, a prosecutor who'd earned the moniker Hitler's Bloodhound hammered them with questions. She sat on a wooden chair in the back of the courtroom. Other chairs held high-ranking Nazi officers. At the center of the room sat a panel of 5 judges. Everyone there was German except her. When it was her turn, she approached the stand. She was emaciated, her lungs ravaged by tuberculosis she'd contracted in prison. How long she stood there remains unknown. Surviving documents don't note the time the prosecutor began questioning her or the time he stopped. What is known is this: the answers she gave him were lies, real whoppers. The judges believed her. The sentence she received was considered mild: 6 years of hard labor in a prison camp. 2 days later, Hitler overrode the verdict and ordered her execution. On February 16, 1943, She was strapped to a guillotine and beheaded.
I'm going to read the conclusion from Hemingway's Widow, The Life and Legacy of Mary Welsh Hemingway. Ernest believed Mary was essential to his creative work, and she thought the sacrifice of her career in journalism was a valuable contribution to the artistic achievements of her husband. When Mary survived Ernest, she felt entitled to the estate she had helped to create. Her desire to control Ernest's legacy and the works he had stored in bank vaults was compensatory for the freedom she gave up in marrying him. If she could not control her life when she was with him, she could do it afterward. Like many widows, she idolized the relationship once he was gone. The tough little girl who sang Irish ballads with her father in the wheelhouse of the steamboat Northland maneuvered her way into wartime journalism and became the first woman writing about foreign affairs for Time Life. Mary survived the worst of the Blitz and thrived in London's chaotic, sex-charged atmosphere, dating generals, journalists, and novelists, and sleeping with whom she pleased. When Ernest Hemingway came along, Mary was not intimidated by the world-famous writer, only the latest man to pursue her. She eventually succumbed to Ernest's insistent overtures, believed he loved her, and married him. Despite his occasional cruelty, she knew he did not have the courage, when he was sober, to ask her to leave him. He needed her fine, clear intelligence to guide him like a compass. Mary loved him despite himself, and her underlying optimism and strength kept her sane during the downward spiral of his health and spirit. She survived his suicide and loved being Hemingway's widow, directing his literary legacy and enjoying the celebrity it brought to her. Enduring occasional loneliness, she filled her days with writing, public speaking, friends, and glamorous social events. For a woman born in 1908 in a tiny lumber town in Minnesota, Mary lived a surprisingly independent life on the world stage. She met and provoked her generation's leading politicians, military leaders, and writers with a lively, mocking sense of humor. Yet a firm understanding of her own worth sustained Mary throughout her life, and she set her moral compass to pragmatic. Mary was brave and tough and pursued her interests passionately. Writing gave her life meaning, and when she finished her memoir and the exciting promotional tour that followed, she gave up her typewriter and surrendered to gin.
In the 1940s, Elizabeth went home to Lexington, Kentucky during the summers to work on short stories and 2 early novels. The advantage of free room and board undercut by her emotional stress. I was frightened of getting trapped there, she recalled. I was always maneuvering to come back. She realized that her first novel was not worthy of being published, but by working on it, as she said later, you get rid of a lot of childish things, and you learn a good deal about how to write. Elizabeth was too insecure about her hoped-for career to announce it to her family. I have dreams of stories in mind if I can ever get around to doing them, she confided to her friend Sally. Right now, after typing the first draft of her novel, I never want to see a typewriter again. Elizabeth wrote that she planned to return to New York in early September. If I don't get to New York, Mama is petitioning to have me put in the asylum for the crazy and mad, she joked. Sally was evidently planning to stay in Manhattan too, and Elizabeth hoped to find an apartment in a residence club. One problem, besides their up-in-the-air plans, was that she had exactly $1.98. Maybe, she added wistfully, $1 could serve as a deposit. In another letter written from home, Elizabeth informed Sally that she was sleeping like a fool. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and say, "Watch it, Hardwick, you don't want to sleep your life away." That this summer she arose at 7 o'clock in the morning to start writing. Although daylight savings had begun a month earlier in Lexington, her mother stubbornly chose not to put the clocks ahead. "What are you hurrying for?" she asked, to Elizabeth's irritation. Turning to the topic of suitors, Elizabeth reported that the phone was not ringing, which isn't the complete joy I expected. If the date drought kept up, she would be calling her New York boyfriend long distance, just to talk, which would have been an expensive luxury in those days. Walking down to the drugstore alone to drink my evening Coke, and playing pinball with the masses. She missed Manhattan terribly. Elizabeth also spent Christmas back home during these years. Wearing the fur coat she had purchased at a thrift shop, she would travel to Lexington on the George Washington passenger train of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. Decades later, she described a stinging green stillness along the way, the hills rising up on either side to cradle the train as it slipped through the valleys. One Christmas, her mother, Mary, had wanted bedroom slippers, but Elizabeth decided to buy something much nicer. I thought the sense of guilt would be touched by such an act from one so poor. She asked her mother, "Do you think $16.95 is too much for me to pay for your present?" Meant as a joke, Elizabeth hadn't actually bought anything yet. This remark was taken seriously. Her mother felt she had to reciprocate, bringing home a bounty of pig's feet, sausage, figs, Limburger cheese, and other unwanted food. Elizabeth felt called upon to up the ante, so she bought her mother a $9 dress. "I had to do it," she wrote. "I had to win."
My book is a collective biography of 7 women in mid-20th century America. The thread that connects them is their professional ambition. Contrary to the cultural norms of the time, these women aspired to and succeeded in so-called men's jobs. I'm going to read from the chapter about Frida Garcia, who became a leader in the nonprofit community in Boston. I interviewed her twice, and you'll hear her words along with mine. In 1941, when she was 8 years old, Frida Garcia left Santo Domingo, the city where she was born, and arrived in New York with her mother and brother. Ostensibly, they came for medical consultations. My brother had problems, epilepsy and some mental incapacity, Frida said. That was sort of the reason we came, to see some doctors. But the trip became a springboard to a new life in the United States, where her mother could be free of an unhappy marriage. Social taboos would have defined her life had she been a separated or divorced woman in the Dominican Republic. If my mother had stayed, she would have had to live with her parents. I don't think she ever planned to go back. Instead, New York offered an enticing freedom. In her passport photo, Frida wears the dress her mother made, intricately styled, belted and embroidered, and finished with a bolero-length braided jacket. My mother barely knew how to cook, but the one thing she had been taught was sewing. That skill would be her way to earn an income. No one in the family spoke English when they arrived. After a short stay in the Bronx, they went to Upper Manhattan, where everyone spoke Spanish, and slang and accents varied block by block. What I remember is 108th Street was sort of Cuban, 109th was mostly Puerto Rican, and 110th, where we lived, was Dominican. My mother never did learn to speak English, but within about 2 months, I was thoroughly bilingual. That's the way it happens when you're 8. With her language proficiency, Frida could travel around the city independently. With my brother, whom I adored and who had a kind of photographic memory, we wandered all over the place. We never got lost and went everywhere, she said. Of all the places she went, she liked the library best. I could walk to the public library about 9 blocks away. I read all the time. That really saved me. Books fed her intellectual curiosity, something she would have to safeguard in the face of others' assumptions about what a girl should do with her life.
Chapter 2. On the 3rd of January 1938, a few weeks after completing his formal education, 16-year-old Stuart Coburn started as a £1 a week copy boy with the Advertiser newspaper. He arrived on a mild summer's day at the paper's Weymouth Street building in the centre of Adelaide at 8:30 a.m., a half hour early, and walked around the block several times to fill in time. Once inside, he discovered a world not much changed since his father had worked there 30 years earlier. Quote, Dickensian-looking old men with wispy white hair and green eye shades, patriarchs of the printed word, dominated the editorial department, scratching their lines with steel-nibbed wooden pens, scorning younger colleagues clattering on typewriters." Close quote. For Stuart, though, the chaos, the smells, the Morse code machine bringing news from other states, the occasional crackle of a shortwave radio, the battery of wall clocks telling the time in London, Cape Town, or Buenos Aires, it was all the purest magic. Chapter 4, nearly 8 years later. Coburn arrived in Melbourne in mid-October 1945, 2 months after the end of the war in the Pacific and nearly 6 months after the war's end in Europe. He had turned 24 on the 16th of October, just over a year after his promotion to a C-grade journalist. The move to the Melbourne Herald was the first step in his plan to gain experience interstate and eventually overseas. He left behind his mother Ruby, his close boyhood friends, his beloved home of Adelaide. The complex emotions that ensued, as well as his evolving political views and personal philosophy, are revealed in his correspondence with friends, particularly his best friend Hugh Gilmore, as well as in letters to his work colleagues and mentors. During this period, he developed an important relationship with Sir Keith Murdoch. Coburn was a beneficiary of Murdoch's well-known lifelong devotion to hand-picking and grooming young men for his papers. Although Coburn was hardly one of the most visible of Murdoch's white-haired boys, Murdoch took a special interest in advancing Coburn's career over the next few years. While there might be much to criticize in the way Murdoch wielded his considerable media power, there is no doubt that many young journalists benefited from his focus on training them well and inspiring them with his appeal to the highest purposes of journalism. Coburn's spell at the Herald was critical to his development as a journalist.
This clipping comes from the middle of the book as Cannell is writing Mr. Bridge, his companion novel, to Mrs. Bridge. The portrait of Walter Bridge is not pretty. He is a man of his world, a prosperous white lawyer in 1930s and early 1940s America. Part of what had made Mrs. Bridge such a timeless account of mid-century society was Cannell's radar for themes of race and class. Now, as he worked on the sequel, the nation had experienced enormous upheavals. There was the gut punch of the Kennedy assassination. There were the struggles for civil rights, the marches, the legislative advancements, the culture of protest. While all of that lay in the future for the Bridge family of fiction, those present-day realities undoubtedly helped Cannell craft the family's retrospective story. Cannell's keen awareness of the racial landscape of his hometown surely added to the thematic urgency of this new novel. Race is something like the exposed nerve in the body of Mr. Bridge, both the character and the book. It echoes even a half-century later. In one scene, India Bridge has come across a magazine news story with a photograph of a lynching. She points this out to her husband. His answer could have come out of the mouth of any tone-deaf plutocrat of his day or ours. Quote, "There are many fine people in the South. What did this fellow do?" When asked whether he was aiming for something universal in the novel, Cannell once said he wasn't, at least not consciously, though it's certainly true that some of Mr. Bridges' bigotry can be found everywhere in America, everywhere in the world for that matter. Despite his soft-shoe rejection of the idea, Cannell certainly intended for race and racism to be an important sub-theme of Mr. Bridge. He emphasized the point 2 months after he submitted his manuscript by sending in 2 more race-oriented chapters. In one, a minor crisis and upset ensue when Carolyn Bridge orders the family's black maid to sweep some leaves from the back steps. In the other, Walter Bridge wonders who is killing the neighborhood dogs by adulterating their food with ground glass. His mind settles on some of the black men who work nearby. Quote, "I think both add somewhat to the relationship between Mr. B and Negroes," Cannell told his contact at Knopf, which I think is one of the significant lines of his character. Cannell did not overtly state what had to have been on his mind. He offered up these two new vignettes about race in a letter of June 21, 1968, 2.5 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the resultant riots in Kansas City and elsewhere, and barely 2 weeks after the killing of Robert F. Kennedy, who was in the midst of a presidential campaign based, at least in part, on a theme of racial healing. Thank you.
In late August 1945, two trucks stirred up plumes of dust on a dirt road in western New Mexico as they neared the delivery point for the oil drilling equipment they carried. It had been a long trip from their starting point in Oklahoma City to this barren spot on the edge of the Navajo Nation. For one of the two drivers, still nursing wounds from combat in the war that had just ended, the long trek had been particularly arduous. The vision in his left eye was limited, the landmine damage to his left leg still gave him a pronounced limp, and haunting memories of the war remained fresh in his mind. On this late afternoon, as he drove the last miles of the journey, a group of Navajos dressed in ceremonial clothes emerged on horseback from the side of the road in front of him, crossed over, and disappeared among the piñons and junipers. A few miles later, upon reaching the delivery site, he asked the white rancher what the Navajos he saw had been doing, especially dressed in that manner. The riders, said the man, were headed to an enemy way, a Navajo ceremony to cleanse two returning Marines of evil to which they had been exposed while fighting in the Pacific. Would they let him attend, the driver asked. Yes, said the man. They would likely permit it if he didn't disturb the ceremony with drink or rude behavior. That night, 20-year-old Tony Hillerman parked his truck and limped over to the campfires where the Navajos were gathered. I still remember, he wrote years later, the bonfires lining that packed earth dance ground, the dust raised by shuffling feet, the flickering yellow firelight, and the perfume of the burning piñons and junipers, the sparks blown into the night breeze, the four drummers, and the smell of roasted mutton, and two Marines, exhausted but happy to be cured of the war, home again, surrounded by their friendly people. Years would pass before Hillerman returned. When he did, however, he would be the one to create unforgettable memories for millions of readers around the globe with novels that captured Navajo culture and the people's spiritual devotion to achieving Horso, or harmonious existence with one's surrounding and place in life. In doing so, Hillerman would travel a path of healing that began that night in the summer of 1945. He, like the two Marines, would find in the Navajo world a salve for the horrors of combat. He would come, as the Navajos might say, to walk in beauty.
Once pain management became his passion, Michael Cousins spent his evenings buried in books. Every night after dinner with his parents and brother Jeff, he headed to the makeshift study he'd created onto his family's bungalow. Bookshelves filled with dog-eared textbooks lined the walls, and white index cards covered in tiny writing and anatomical illustrations littered his desk. Sitting at the oak desk late into the night, he searched for clues on how to reduce his patient's pain. One night he read that an authoritative textbook had been written on pain. I must find it, he thought, impatient to read the book. He scribbled the details in a small notebook, then placed it in his battered leather briefcase. At the crack of dawn the following Saturday, Michael jolted awake, even though his last shift for the week had ended only a few hours earlier. After a breakfast of weak German molasses, terrible stuff that sporting coaches touted as increasing athletic performance, he drove to Sydney University. On the dot of 9 o'clock, a sprightly woman with bobbed grey hair and round glasses opened the heavy wooden doors. Michael smelled the familiar musty odour that brought back memories of spending long hours studying in the library during medical school. He headed straight to the catalogue, a series of wooden drawers filled with white index cards, then looked up B. Yes, it's here, Michael gasped, barely able to contain his excitement. He'd found Professor John J. Bonika's hefty textbook from 1953, The Management of Pain, the only book that discussed everything known about pain and its treatment. Michael made a beeline for the shelf that held the key to his future, hurriedly scanning the call numbers. His heart pounded as he glimpsed the bulky tome. He read that John Bonica, an anaesthetist, launched a pioneering pain centre in America in the 1940s. and that one way he treated his patient's pain was by injecting local anaesthetic onto a nerve to numb it. This technique is a nerve block, and Michael decided to try it on some of his patients. He also learned that ideas of the 17th century philosopher René Descartes still influenced pain treatments in the 1960s. Descartes believed that pain signals travel from injured tissues in the body to a pain center in the brain. This hardwired concept of pain is like a telephone cable system with electrical impulses running from the surface of the skin to the spinal cord, and then to the brain where a bell rings when the pain arrives. It surprised Michael that knowledge about pain had progressed little during the previous 3 centuries, and he wondered how Descartes' theory applied to his patients suffering from persistent pain. He resolved to find out.